Hospital, as well as the medical director of the West Central Montreal Health Network Mental Health Program. Bonjour et bienvenue à tous, surtout ceux qui ont voyagé de loin pour être ici aujourd'hui, ainsi que nos voisins et collègues de l'Université de Montréal et UQAM également. J'espère que votre séjour parmi nous sera à la fois agréable et productif. I would like to thank especially Maxwell Ramstead, who is the Douglas Utting Postdoctoral Fellow here at the Jewish General Hospital this year, for his ambition and vision in establishing this network, which is quite an auspicious type of plan, and also this event, which brings together such an impressive group of researchers from all over the world. I'd like to also mention that as the Douglas Utting Fellow, he'll be presenting on Thursday afternoon. We have an event at 1:30 till 3 here in the amphitheater. We honor a scholar who has made a significant contribution to the study of depression. And the scholar is Erin Michalak, who's coming from University of British Columbia, and she's a recent addition to the network here. Our department has had a long tradition and interest in social and cultural research, and so I see this as a great opportunity to extend this work, including novel and innovative methods from the neuroscience and computational psychiatry field. So I wish you all welcome and a productive and pleasant time with us this week. And I will pass it over to Dr. Kirmayer.
Welcome to all of you. This is a very exciting week that we have together, and we're all looking forward to it very much. I want to begin by acknowledging support from the Jewish General Department of Psychiatry for this workshop, and I'll also mention the foundation that has given major funding for this workshop this week. What I wanted to do by way of introduction to all of you is tell you a little bit about where you are right now in the sort of academic context of McGill and of Montreal, and then say a few words about the sort of intellectual context of this work, and then Maxwell will get into more detail about how we imagine this workshop actually sort of unrolling over the next few days. So I direct a program at McGill called the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry, which goes back to the mid-1950s. It's the oldest program in the world devoted specifically to cultural issues in mental health. And it was driven from the beginning by the interests of trainees who are coming from different parts of the world, usually former Commonwealth countries, from East and West Africa, from Asia, who were coming for conventional psychiatric training, but who raised issues about how well what they were learning really translated to the very different contexts that they were working in. And rather than just viewing that as a sort of a knowledge translation problem, it was seen as an opportunity to try to learn something about variations in the experience of mental health problems. And it's grown up over the years to be a highly interdisciplinary program that includes lots of people from social science, from anthropology. It was originally founded, in fact, by a partnership between Eric Witkauer from psychiatry and Jack Fried from anthropology. So from the very beginning it's had this kind of dialogue between social science and psychiatry. It's in that context that some of this work has sort of emerged for us. And in particular, it's emerged in recent years in the form of a program affiliated with the division that we're calling Culture, Mind, and Brain, that seeks to engage with contemporary neuroscience in ways that can really be meaningfully applied to psychiatry. As you know, psychiatry has invested its hopes very heavily in neuroscience with the notion that mental disorders are brain disorders. We think that, some of us think that that's problematic, in particular if the brain is conceived of in isolation from its environment, that it's going to lead to very inadequate, incomplete answers, both about the nature of problems and about potential solutions. So the overarching concern for us, and I'll say a few more words about it in a moment, is to push back against that somewhat reductionist view to try to advance a kind of neuroscience that's fit for purpose, that really engages with the human being and with the brain as an adaptive organ that depends very heavily on its environment, not only developmentally, but in its ongoing functioning day to day. So underneath the very specific work and kinds of models and paradigms that you'll be discussing and that we'll be exploring in terms of potential experimental work, underneath that is this larger sort of philosophical concern. And we've been helped in trying to address that in recent years by two programs. One is this Foundation for Psychocultural Research, which is a foundation based in Los Angeles, founded by an anthropologist, Robert Lemelson, who's also a philanthropist. And he developed a series of programs, training programs initially, to try to produce a new generation of scholars who would be comfortable in social science, neuroscience, and developmental psychology. So the idea is people would have enough comfort with each of these kinds of academic disciplines that they could engage in meaningful collaboration. That program started, I guess, about 15 years ago, and they've trained several cohorts of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows, and people are, work is emerging. I mean, I think this activity has gone on in parallel, obviously, with much larger changes in the field and widespread interest in interdisciplinarity, and so it's been part and parcel of a process of trying to engage with these things. And this year we got a grant from the foundation to support this Culture, Mind, and Brain program, and then we got a separate grant which Maxwell wrote specifically to fund this workshop. So we're very happy with that. And it's one reason why, though, you'll see as we go along that we're hoping to film the plenary talks and eventually make them available on the web as one way that this foundation can sort of give back and try to stimulate the larger academic community to engage with some of these issues. So you'll have a chance to look at the video afterward and decide if you're happy with it, or if there's a certain, I have a tendency to editorialize very heavily and express my political views at, the drop of a hat. So, you're free to edit those things out if you decide at the end that that's not what you want on YouTube. So. The foundation, as I mentioned, has supported a whole series, this Foundation for Psychocultural Research, a whole series of interdisciplinary workshops over the years that have led to a number of volumes. And the one on the right is one that's just gone to press, actually, this morning. So it speaks to, again, this idea of trying to bring not only current innovative ideas in neuroscience to bear on issues of how we understand ourselves as cultural beings, but also to engage with equally sophisticated social science. So that's the overall aspiration, and we hope that this network is going to be part of that process. Another source of funding and support, not for this particular project, but for other activities, has been a program at McGill called Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives. This is a huge project on the order of about $85 million funded by the Canada First Research Excellence Fund, which aims to foster big data neuroscience to address major neurological and mental health issues. It's based at the Montreal Neurological Institute on the other side of the mountain. And it's supposed to have within it a very large social science component. I should say that it's been an uphill struggle to get that component adequately represented, but we're able to do a lot with a small amount of funds compared to what happens in other areas of science. And so it's an ongoing process of trying to find ways to build bridges between these different academic disciplines, particularly since one aim of HPHL, in addition to trying to advance computational neuroscience and big data applications to public health issues, is to generate a framework for policy. To be able to integrate insights from neuroscience into health and social policy. And to do that in a way, hopefully, that is well-informed, that isn't just what we typically get in the newspaper, which is every week it's another breakthrough, and then the breakthrough one week contradicts the one from the previous week, and so we go. And that kind of, which is, I think, a natural consequence both of everyone's interest in this field, but also the sort of distortions that happen when one's busy writing grants promising the world in each grant and kind of then having to come back down to reality. So policy clearly needs to be a little bit more balanced and realistic, and in a sense, the same issue that we're promoting here in terms of our theories about mind, brain, and culture, which is it needs to be context sensitive. It needs to look at the real world settings in which knowledge is being applied. So we hope to be able to contribute to that through the kind of work that we're talking about today. part of why this is so important for us here, you know, you're sitting in the auditorium of the outpatient psychiatry department, essentially, of this hospital, which is one of 5 McGill teaching hospitals. It's a community hospital built in an inner city neighborhood that is highly diverse. About 85% of the people living in this, no, 65% of the people living in this neighborhood were born outside the country from about 85 different countries. So we have kind of hyper-diversity. It's just a reality of who we are. And this auditorium was built, originally this was one of the centers for the development and of teaching and training in family therapy. And so this was a place where family cases were often presented in front of clinicians. So systemic thinking has been important in this department since its inception in the 60s. That's important because we live at a time when, as a psychiatry, which once embraced systemic thinking quite widely, and you know, when I trained here, in fact, many years ago, family therapy training was a very large part of our training. It's now a much smaller part. And that, I think, is unfortunate because, as we may have occasion to discuss over the week, systemic thinking is one way to build bridges across the kind of different levels that we're interested in. In the context of psychiatry, as I say, this is very important because we're presented with a kind of technology and, you know, psychiatric nosology and various other ways of looking at problems that tends to view mental health problems as discrete issues that occur inside the skull of one individual and that don't understand them as transactionally, as interactional, as embedded in systems. So that's part of what we're pushing back against, to sort of keep the purview of psychiatry large and pertinent, really, to the kinds of problems that people have. And so this, again, is not only a dilemma at the clinical level, but it, as I mentioned already, we had, you know, in the 80s, we had the decades of the brain, and then we've had never-ending decades of the brain since then. So there's a clear sense in psychiatry that this is going to give us all the answers, even though my colleagues have sat in the same auditorium and bemoaned the fact that over the 30 to 40 years of their career, there's been relatively modest, if any, changes in our fundamental therapeutics. So it's a bit bizarre that on the one hand, we have fantastic advances in terms of our understanding of brain mechanisms and so on, and very few and very poorly understood changes in therapeutics. So part of the issue has, you know, is sort of outlined in this article, which was written as a kind of critique of the NIMH RDoC framework, pointing out that by investing so heavily in existing neuroscience paradigms, we're bracketing off from the start all kinds of interesting issues that might be relevant to human beings, having to do with language, having to do with self-understanding, having to do with relationships, identity, and so on and so forth. So in the long run, we're looking for a way to enrich our neuroscience so that it will actually be fit for purpose, that it will actually address some of the core issues that we see in clinical settings and allow us, if not to understand those in brain-centric terms, at least to build meaningful bridges between what we can understand at that level and what needs to be understood at a more cognitive or social or ecological level. So, and it's betrayed in this sort of, you know, basic scheme from RDoC, where a lot of the investment is in this idea of trying to understand brain circuitry and, you know, connectomics, and the ability to begin to dissect functional circuitry has been a huge set of advances in terms of technologies and contemporary neuroscience. But the peculiarity that then all the higher levels of human functioning are collapsed into this column of self-report, as though it's, you know, that's what it is, this checklist that we get from people or something, and that's as rich the phenomenology or as a contextualization as we're going to get of human problems. So this is the problem that we're facing, and we want to push back against that, not in a nihilistic way or as a bunch of sort of, you know, Luddites. That we're interested in how neuroscience can be framed in a sufficiently sophisticated way that it actually addresses our fundamental social and cultural being. And the book that I showed you, which has just been sent in, tries to make this argument in the first chapter with my co-authors, arguing that the brain is in effect the organ of culture, that it's plastic and, you know, born immature and plastic, precisely to acquire culture, to be remodeled and rewired on the basis of cultural context. And brain-culture interactions go on multiple time scales. They've gone on evolutionarily and co-evolutionarily in our very constitution, and then they go on various more shorter time scales, coming down to our moment-to-moment interactions with environments. And when we get to the end of this is where I think we're beginning to talk about the kind of broad setting in which the research that people will be talking about over the week is relevant. I won't belabor this further, but just to say that there is this sort of larger set of concerns that can still feed into the way in which hypotheses are generated about what might be going on in a particular context. You probably know that a lot of the work on gene culture interactions shows that there are many genes that have been interpreted certain ways, like oxytocin receptor genes and so on, that turn out not simply to code for something like attachment, but to code for much more abstract things like sensitivity to social cues. So the notion that we end up having sort of gene culture context interactions, and that's where the money is, that's where we're going to be able to show really interesting things, I think is relevant again to how we conceptualize looking at brain function and, you know, coupled dyads or other kinds of situations that we'll be talking about over the week. Behind this, again, is this understanding that where human experience comes from is not simply from the bottom up, that is a kind of neuro phenomenology, just reflecting the wiring of our nervous system, but always already embedded in our own self-awareness, our own interpretive processes, our own culturally learned habits and responses, which are undergirding the way in which a phenomena unfolds over time. And I think that's, again, the challenge, is not to sort of create a kind of simple unilinear idea that something happens in the brain and we have a self-report of what's going on, but to understand these kinds of looping effects which occur in real time and very rapidly as an experience unfolds. This actually illustration comes from discussion of sleep paralysis, which is about as biologically patterned a set of experiences as you could imagine in terms of, you know, waking up from REM sleep and having muscle paralysis and then having a certain phenomenology that unfolds from that. But in reality varies widely in terms of how people experience it and report it, varies widely across cultures because that momentary experience of feeling paralyzed and trying to figure out what it means immediately becomes embedded in all past experiences that one has had within a cultural milieu. So one sees and feels different things and has different kinds of emotional reactions and so on. So that's what's important for psychiatry. That kind of cultural neurophenomenology is what we actually see in the clinic, not a kind of highly stripped down, controlled, you know, laboratory setting in which we try to pair that stuff off. And I would suggest to you, you know, that even those laboratory settings that we create where we try to control everything are themselves embedded in a larger cultural context. And it's only because we're taking that for granted that we don't have to think about that very much until we start working across cultural settings. So the bigger picture of that kind of embedding is something that looks a little bit like this, the notion that at the bottom we have embodied processes that are giving some shape to our experience, but at the same time we're drawing from narrative forms that we've acquired both developmentally and that we're embedded in from moment to moment as we interpret our own experience and try to make sense of it. And we have, you know, plenty of interesting work in cognitive science around the embodied nature of metaphoric processing and so on, that we can think even in terms of a kind of psychophysiology of metaphor that's pertinent to people's symptom experience. With Maxwell and Samuel Vessier and others here, we've been particularly interested in trying to take current paradigms of predictive processing and active inference and apply them to how we might think about this organism-environment coupling and use that to begin to think about this broad notion of cultural affordances, this idea that we're embedded developmentally and on a moment-to-moment basis in particular contexts in a culturally shaped world, and that we think with and through that world, and that world is primarily made up of other people. So that framework really challenges the way that sort of medical and psychiatric semiotics works. So the oval at the top is sort of the whole thing that the DSM is founded on and most medical semiotics, which is the idea that something happens inside you and you notice it and you report it to other people. And now it can be counted, oh, you're having hallucinations, okay, it can be counted as a symptom. But we know from cognitive psychology, from social psychology, from all kinds of work, that that process of translating whatever might be happening in the body and the brain into an experience and moreover into a self-report is embedded in all kinds of other processes. So it reflects those processes. And that's, again, what we want to somehow begin to tease apart to have a much more accurate model of what's going on and a way to think about where problems come from and how to intervene. That leads even to this notion that what creates a clinical problem, because again, for many of us, we're interested in the basic nature of human functioning, But again, we're in a clinical setting, so one of the concerns is, can that knowledge be applied to understand the sorts of problems that people have and the things that we can do to help them? And so one thing that this way of thinking leads to is a notion that a lot of what we're looking at in clinical problems is not necessarily simply a dysfunction at some or other brain circuit, but kind of vicious circles, if you will, some of which are internal to how the brain's regulating itself and processing information, some of which traverse the social world, and they're vicious circles between people or between people in the political economic context that they live in. And I think what's interesting about this for us, first of all, that is obviously that what you'll be talking about in terms of hyperscanning and other things speaks directly to a certain level of this kind of potential for looping, but it also insists in a way that the cognitive and social levels of the process we're talking about are every bit as real, as material as studying a brain circuit. That is to say, the circuits of the mind go beyond the brain to engage the social world. And we can study that in very material and concrete ways. So I think hopefully I'm just saying things that are trite to you in a way because you're trying to hone in and find ways to really study that in a concrete sense. So as I say, we've been trying to approach this a little bit from the other side, that is not from the brain-centric side, but from the looking at the social world and trying to find ways to begin to characterize social context that can fully engage with what we're learning from models of predictive processing and other kinds of brain models, and that culminates in this highly abstract and very, symmetrically pleasing figure that acknowledges that just as the brain is modeling the world is being reshaped to model the brain. And this is what we're trying to somehow unpack, not in a totally abstract and contentless way, but in very specific ways related to the architecture of the brain, related to the histories and so on that get us there. So this is my last slide in terms of what some of the issues are for social, cultural, computational psychiatry. At the core of this is a conviction that we will need a multi-level, multi-scale model of human functioning, that no one level of description will ever be adequate because we're constituted by a kind of complicated, many-layered kind of being, and there's certain aspects of our functioning that emerge precisely because of that structure, so we have to have a way to capture that. Moreover, and this is a challenge for predictive processing and other models that have underneath them a kind of optimization principle, that human nature, evolutionary outcomes are highly historically contingent, that we are the way we are because of many accidents of history, and we can't back out of those corners that we've got ourselves into. We have to somehow forge ahead with all the wonkiness that happens as a result of that. So that's one way to begin to understand some of the trouble we get ourselves into in different environments that we create for ourselves and so on. So we have to somehow find ways of dealing with that. And also this notion that history is not only, we don't only bear the traces of that in the architecture of our brains and so on, and our distribution of genes and populations, but in the actual environments we inhabit on a daily basis. So we have to be able to characterize those. What that leads us toward is a picture of culture, of our own sort of designed environments and self-fashioned social world, constructing the brain in some sense, and not in the narrow, nominalist sort of constructivist view that we simply give words for things and those words become realities for us, but literally in the sense of through culturally patterned developmental experiences, we end up with certain kinds of brains that are good at doing some things and have a hard time with others. Once we can characterize those dynamics better, not only within the brain but between people and in social environments, we are set to begin to think, or we can work it the other way too, I suppose, begin to think about psychopathology and about what can go wrong. So we can do it the other way because there's a long history, as you know, again, in neuroscience of using brain injury and accidents and manipulations that in fact create kinds of pathology to study underlying mechanisms. But there's always the dilemma that maybe what we're seeing is, the organism's reaction to pathology, not the way the organism usually functions. So having it both ways is very much something that we need. That is to say, looking at pathology as a key to understanding brain function, but also looking at brain function in healthy contexts. And finally, the overall goal, as I say, is to advance a view of the brain of human functioning that is social, ecological, we call it eco-social for purposes of having a simpler vocabulary, and that is going to contribute to a kind of psychiatry in the end and indeed healthcare and other areas of life that is not disease or disorder centered, but that is person centered, that is interested in how people can flourish and what they need in terms of social environments, in terms of other people, in terms of yeah, all of that good stuff. So that's my little both. I think I said some of the main things I need to tell you in terms of institutional settings. Happy to tell you more, explain more about other things at later dates or as we go along. I hope we'll all have a good chance to get to know each other. We do not have name tags, so you need to introduce yourself to each other. And we're going to have some time later this morning where we can all say a few words about ourselves, and so we'll begin to imprint each other's names and somewhere in some part there. Yeah, I guess I just want to turn it over to Maxwell. And I'm happy if any of you have anything in particular that I can help you with, or our administrative coordinator, Andy Clarice, or anyone, please let us know. We'd like you to be comfortable here and to have a really stimulating time, and look forward to collaborating with all of you in the future.